10 years ago on this day, 26 people, 20 of them children, died at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown. We don't call this an anniversary. I don't know that we even entirely know what to call it. I also don't know that we, the people of Connecticut, we the people who maybe were a little bit more closely involved than some other people. I'm not even sure we know how to live alongside it and to be alongside it. I find that I sort of have two choices. One of them is simply not to think about the reality of it and do my job, or to think about the reality of it, at which point it becomes almost impossible to do my job. So we are going to talk today a little bit later to one of the parents, Scarlett Lewis, of a child, Jesse Lewis, who was murdered at Sandy Hook. We're going to talk to John Woodall, who was somebody I talked to a lot 10 years ago. He's a psychiatrist, and he is also a representative of the Baha'i community, part of the Newtown Interfaith Council. But we're going to begin with somebody who's, I think, very familiar to most of you. Governor Dannel Malloy was governor of the state of Connecticut at the time of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. Prior to that, he was mayor of Stamford. He's currently chancellor of the University of Maine system. Governor, welcome back to our airwaves.
Yeah, I can't say it's good to be with you on this occasion, but I'm happy to help people understand.
Yeah, so I'm going to begin with you. I know people who know you pretty well. And at the time, and for a year or two following that, they said, he's different. This changed him. You are obviously there at the firehouse in Newtown. We can talk a little bit about that as we go along. But I'd just like to talk about you for a second. Although you were mayor of Stamford at the time of 9/11, when there were people who left on trains who didn't come back, this is different, obviously. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about, I don't know, how it feels today. I mean, I'm assuming I'm correct that it did change you.
Yeah. I mean, I think every experience, good and terribly bad, that's certainly what this one was, changes you. That's why we're lent a number of years on the earth, and somebody checks to see whether we amounted to anything or did anything that was good or important. But I don't know how much it changed me. I know that getting there and understanding the gravity of the situation that day, and quite frankly, the chaos that situation was creating, was something that I needed to respond to, or felt the obligation to respond to, and did that on that day and for many days thereafter. People have said it changed me. I had work to do, and I set about doing it.
It's the thing that I said at the beginning, though, when you have work to do. And I know that feeling. I mean, when this started, John Dankosky and I were on the air together for days doing our job. And doing our job meant not thinking too closely about this, because you just burst into tears and you can't do your job. I mean, if you really think about what had happened, there's just no way to go forward. But there are moments for introspection, moments where it all quiets down, moments where you don't, as governor, have a job to do. And I guess I'm thinking about those moments, too. I mean, you, first of all, were confronted with constituents, with citizens of Connecticut who were in about as much pain as people can possibly be in. And maybe we could talk a little bit about how that felt starting on that day when you, in fact, had to deal with them in very real time as they became aware of all this.
There was a collective sorrow that engulfed the school on the hill and the firehouse on the bottom of the hill and the families and the broader community. I mean, it was just a horrendous situation to encounter, and something that nobody in Connecticut had seen before. And the not having the complete answer of exactly what had happened and whose life had been taken, and then having that reveal itself over a period of time it was a crushing experience, I think, for anybody at the firehouse and anyone who had been in the school. And sometimes I wonder how the people who recovered their children felt as well. And there but for the grace of God, right, is something that they have had to live with for the 10 years. And then, of course, the families themselves who lost their loved ones or their spouses, their children or their spouses. I think of them frequently. Some of those folks became friends. We worked together on gun issues and other issues. And, it's just horrendous. And then, quite frankly, other people too, Danny Stebbins, who worked so hard, and all of the state police and all of the responding officers from Newtown and from surrounding communities. And quite frankly, the fire department folks who lent their facility for days on end, but particularly that day was, I think of all of those folks and how people's lives were interrupted or disturbed, or they bore witness to something that they never wished to bear witness to.
Right. So let's talk about actually just for a minute or two. And I don't want to dwell on this too much, partly because I know you've had to tell this story more than one time recently. And when I read Elizabeth Williamson's remarkable book, Sandy Hook, I read that story really for the first time I've ever seen. You told it to her in more detail than I've ever known you to tell it. But you were faced with a very difficult situation. There was actually a rule or a policy in place that prohibited the notification of survivors, of parents, of loved ones of a death until the death had been confirmed in a certain way. And that would have involved these bodies going to Farmington, where the state medical examiner, Wayne Carver, would have to go through. This was going to take hours, days probably, really, before that whole process played out. So you had a group of incredibly anxious and stricken people who needed to know what had happened to their loved ones. And officially, it was really something that you couldn't tell them. So I hope I'm setting this up reasonably well.
Yeah, the protocol is a fairly standard one for police departments. And certainly I even had some knowledge of that, given, I was a prosecutor in New York City for 4 years and did homicide investigation work as well. So I was aware of it, but the circumstances that we were suffering in, where, lots of people rushed to the school grounds and recovered their children. And now I'm with people who don't know where their spouse is or don't know where their children are. And that's a very different situation. And as time went on, it got more and more painful for them and for us, quite frankly, the folks who were bearing witness to this loss. And ultimately, I decided that I couldn't tolerate that going on any longer. We knew how many people had been killed at the school. We knew how many people had gone to the hospital. We had those equations. We didn't have the actual identification of each body, and wouldn't have that perhaps until the next day. And meanwhile, I had this collection of sorrowful people waiting, holding on to some amount of hope. Maybe someone got into the woods. Maybe somebody did something else. And ultimately, without someone to do it, I decided that I would break the news to the folks who were at the firehouse. And I was particularly struck by the fact that there were other children in that room at the time, and how painful and sorrowful that would be for them as a recollection as well. So I did my best to avoid using words like death and dead and the like. And but I think I did the right thing. I think I did it a little later than I probably should have. I think I was kind of following other people's strategies and practicums and policies, and but I knew when I did it that it was the right thing to do.
I think it was the right thing to do. And yeah, I think you used language like not coming back or something like that.
Yeah, if you haven't been reunited with your loved one thus far today, that's not going to happen. And it would be best for us to help you get home and care for yourselves and care for your children and that sort of discussion.
I'm going to ask you to just maybe connect this a little bit to your time as mayor of Stamford. 9/11 was another time where people had to ultimately face the fact that someone who left for work that day, someone who usually came home, was not going to come home. This can happen to anybody. That's the reality of life. The writer Don DeLillo said, "Any breath we draw can be our last." So you as a leader have had to deal with this at least twice, and probably more than that, particularly when you think about maybe even people who were deployed after 9/11 and wound up not coming back from those deployments. So as a leader, this is the hardest thing. It was a thing that was hard for you. President Obama came here to Connecticut. He was obviously just incredibly stricken by this whole thing. As a leader, maybe this isn't the thing that anybody really teaches you, right? How to get people not just through that moment in the firehouse, but how to get people through the days and weeks and months that come from that. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that, about how you lead in that situation?
Well, that's a lot of years we're talking about, 9/11 to 2014 and the years that have transpired since. There was a period of time when I would give talks to incoming governors and mayors about the challenges of office and the importance of being prepared for anything. 9/11, I actually witnessed the crime, right? I saw the plane go into the second tower and the towers come down, and knew that we had lost citizenry. Obviously, it wasn't in Midtown. If it was in Midtown, we would have lost a lot more of our citizens and the like. But I think that experience was a difficult one. I can remember, years later getting a call from somebody in New York saying a body part had been found and identified, and wanted to make sure the family was aware that confirmation had been made, and, sending a police car to somebody's house. So it was slow motion, I guess, in some senses, and no finality because of the loss of the bodies themselves. So sure, I think I called on that experience. I called on my time as a prosecutor and as investigations work that I did in Brooklyn. And you respond, you do the best you can. I was trying to protect people. I about 150 yards from the firehouse is a little office building that had a number of not-for-profit agencies in it. And I took a walk across there wondering whether we could take family by family and do it individually and perhaps more in a kinder way. But I was deluged with people shouting questions from the street, and people wanting to come and have a conversation, and knew that I couldn't take family after family through that. So ultimately decided to share with them their present reality.
I don't know you well, but I think we do know each other. And, your life, I think, has been characterized by an idea of overcoming obstacles, dating back to your childhood when you were dyslexic and often misdiagnosed or misunderstood, all the way through. I think the Dannel Malloy of getting through things is to kind of outwork everybody else, to put in the effort, to be prepared going in, all of those kinds of things. And those kinds of things have resulted in many successes for you. And I'm thinking about, I had two medical crises in my own family, one of which you know a bit about, and they were almost simultaneous. And my friend Greg Butler, who you also know, at one point he said something to me I'll never forget. He said, "You've been getting through your whole life by being smart, and that's not going to help you this time. You're going to have to find other things. You've been sort of thinking your way through problems." And so I think for each of us, we have these skill sets that we know we can deploy in certain situations, and we know that they can often produce fairly good results. But these are situations that don't fit into that category. I mean, Greg could have said something similar to you. Dan, you've been just outworking the world the entire time. You're a workaholic. You just put in the hours. But that might not be what really works in this situation. And I'm not talking just about the firehouse. The firehouse was a moment. I'm talking about the entire time that we've been digesting this tragedy. And I'm wondering about that, whether you had to maybe find some other parts of yourself that you don't usually use to solve problems to help you be a fuller person in this situation.
I'm terrible judge of myself, right? Although I frequently admit errors. The reality is that no one runs for governor to be at a firehouse to tell a room full of people that they're not going to be reunited with their family. I don't know where it came from, that resolve that I had to do that, other than that I knew I wasn't going to have those people spend more time in limbo the way that they were being tortured. And if you're talking about what happened afterwards,
afterwards.
I was grateful to have work to throw myself into. I watched the initial work at the legislature and was greatly dissatisfied by that early work, and basically put out a challenge and as a thing at the minimum that had to be in the package, and then went on I think I did 17 town hall meetings where everybody who wanted to come and yell at me about their perceived God-given right to have a firearm would address me. And I actually did that to show that, you can survive that stuff. There was a thought process. I was not doing it because I liked being yelled at, but that it was part of the process to make sure that the members of the legislature understood that they could survive people being unhappy with them. And so I was very grateful to have that as a way of channeling the angst and the pain and the sorrow that came along with bearing witness to what transpired that day, and then coming to know these, courageous parents who decided that they would pour themselves into trying to make other people's children safer, and put together a commission to examine and make recommendations. And yeah, it was exhausting and it was troubling. And yes, I frequently recalled the circumstances and going to those funerals, but I knew that it was the right thing to do, and therefore I should continue doing it, I suppose, is what I thought.
Last question, Governor. How are you feeling now? This is a time, obviously, that will make it all rush back for all of us. I think that also happened for you in May when the school shootings in Texas happened. How is this sitting with you these days?
It's a fair question. December is, at least the first half of December, is always a little tough. I have some of the parents sent me pictures of their children and Christmas tree ornaments that have pictures. And, I have revisited that day many times in the 10 years that have come and gone. And, I quite frankly pray for the parents and the siblings and the spouses who had losses that hopefully very few of us have had to experience in our life. And certainly none of us have experienced in quite the same way.
All right. Well, Governor Dannel Malloy, thank you so much for being with us. Governor of the state of Connecticut in 2012, 10 years ago when this happened, currently chancellor of the University of Maine system. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you. Take care.
Now we're going to talk to Scarlett Lewis, who founded the Jessie Lewis Choose Love movement after her son. 6-year-old Jessie Lewis was murdered during the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. Scarlett Lewis, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me on, Colin.
Jessie, every single person who was there at Sandy Hook that day was a remarkable person. 20 remarkable children, 6 very special adults. Jessie had a lot of unusual qualities, including almost a sense that something was in the air, right? He said a number of things in the days leading up to it. He left his brother a note. We can talk about that. But perhaps the most remarkable thing he did was write a few words, 3 words on a chalkboard in your house. Tell us about those words.
Yeah, he did many remarkable things. And that saying, hindsight is 20/20, is so meaningful to me right now. There were so many signs from the very beginning. After his murder, I came back to the house and found a message that he had written on our kitchen chalkboard. And this is just the side of my oven. I had taken the chalkboard spray paint and spray painted that. And that was our chalkboard. He had written 3 words: nurturing, healing, love. And, I'm looking at them right now as I'm sitting in my home, and they're phonetically spelled. So like he spelled nurturing, NORURTING, with a backwards G, like a first grader would do. Healing, HELINN, love. And I was floored when I saw those 3 words, because I knew that he had not only left a message of comfort for his family and friends, because it was a tremendous amount of comfort that he would have had a spiritual awareness of this, not a cognitive awareness, but a spiritual awareness. And then I also realized that's the solution. Nurturing, healing, love. If the shooter had been able to give and receive nurturing, healing love, the tragedy would never have happened. And that has really shaped the rest of my life.
It has, and we want to talk about that. I want to point out, at least as I understand it from Elizabeth Williamson's remarkable book, Sandy Hook, you actually have kind of plexiglass over those words now, right? They're kind of protected for as close to forever as possible.
It was a place where we had put brooms and, recycling and things like that. And while my dad was here, he took everything out of that corner and found a piece of plexiglass. It was a really sweet, actually, because people from the town stepped up and helped him find the right size and gave him ideas on how he would install the plexiglass so it wouldn't actually touch the chalk and the writing. It's beautiful. So 10 years later, it's exactly as it was.
So many of you parents, I think, after the long and really kind of endless period of grieving, at some point, many of you seem to ask yourselves versions of the question. And I was just listening to the podcast, Still Newtown, and I heard Mark Barton say these words. The question is, where do I need to be? And your answer to that, it seems, is back out in classrooms where, in fact, these values that are embodied in those three words are lacking. That this is not an isolated incident. It seems as though there are people out there who need nurturing, who need healing, who need love. It seems as though you've tried to kind of address that deficit as best as you can.
I realized that what happened was 100% preventable. And it is in every situation. You don't hear many people saying that. But the bottom line is this: hurt people hurt people. And I realized that we could fortify kids with the essential life skills they need to be able to not only face their pain and trauma, but learn from it, grow through it, and be strengthened by it. Only later on did I realize that there was a scientific term for that, and it's called post-traumatic growth. Most people haven't even heard of that. So we have lots of pain with our kids. I know this. For the last 10 years, I have been traveling around the country and world, speaking to kids and their educators, administrators, speaking in conferences. There is, in fact, I actually wrapped an RV during COVID with student artwork and then took it out on the road, literally driving it to schools, to creating events where the community could come together. And I was astounded by the pain that our kids feel from a very, very young age. And, it's a human thing. We all feel pain, physical, mental, and emotional. It's part of being a human. We all want also to love and be loved. And I realized that we need to give kids the social emotional competence they need to be able to grow from this pain. That's how we're designed as human beings, and to thrive. So that's what I did. I created a program and I made it free and its lifespan. And that's what I've been promoting as addressing the root cause of the suffering that not only led to the Sandy Hook school shooting, but also often leads to mental illness and even substance abuse, because people don't know how to cope with their pain, and they can be taught. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, hurt people hurt people. Hurt people also hurt themselves, and they can hurt themselves in the way that you're saying with drugs. They can hurt themselves to the point of suicide. So maybe say a little bit more about what's in this program. I mean, there's no simple answer. There's no magic wand or magic pill. So what is it that you are trying to imbue school-age children with?
I think that's a really good point that you made, Colin. There is no magic wand. There is no magic pill. There is no magic law that is going to fix all of this. It's going to be going back to the root cause of the suffering that leads to all of this tragedy. And that's lack of the ability to manage pain. Healed people heal people. So that's a positive thing. And so we teach character, social, emotional competence, and we do this in the form of a powerful formula that can help you get in between what is happening in your life and your thoughtful response so that you can choose how you respond. And that is, of course, choosing love. Our power as human beings is in our ability to choose from moment to moment how we respond to certain situations. And they happen to us all day long. Life is a beautiful thing that gives us the ability to practice then these skills and tools. I was just speaking to an elementary school in Arkansas maybe 2 weeks ago. And I showed a little video of a garter snake that was crossing the path where my older son and I were walking. And we took a video of it. It saw us and then it lashed out at us. You know how snakes do with the mouth open? It's kind of scary. And so I asked the kids, hey, why did that snake just lash out like that? And they said, well, he was scared. I said, exactly. Well, he didn't understand. Yes, 100%. You know, all these different reasons. And I said, that's true. But we have something called a prefrontal cortex. It's this latest part of our brain that helps us be able to thoughtfully respond instead of lashing out at people or treating them unkindly. Even when they treat us unkindly, we can take a deep breath and we can think about, get curious, why did they act this way? And of course, most people that are not kind are coming from a point of pain within themselves. And so we can actually thoughtfully respond with compassion and try to help that person with their pain. And that's how we're different from aminals, is what Jesse called animals. So now I call them that, with this prefrontal cortex. Unfortunately, the lizard part of our brain, and we teach all of this neuroscience, is 4 times faster than our human brain. So we really have to learn skills and tools to be able to manage our response. And of course, our brain just wants to keep us safe. So, you know, we really have to use our prefrontal cortex to let it know that in most cases we are safe and we can thoughtfully respond with love.
Scarlett, there are millions of parents out there, and there are millions of educators, and they talk to kids all the time. I get the feeling that you're having a somewhat different kind of conversation than most parents have with their kids on a regular basis, and that most educators have with their classes on a regular basis. In a way, you are talking about subjects that are almost forbidden: fear and pain. Childhood is not supposed to even kind of contain those things, although we, consciously know that it does. I guess I'm wondering what you're seeing in children when you visit these classes. Are you seeing things in them that maybe the rest of us might be missing because we're not asking the right questions?
I will give you an example, Colin. We have a formula, and it's courage plus gratitude plus forgiveness plus compassion and action equals choosing love. This formula helps you thoughtfully respond. You go, it's neuroscientifically accurate, and you do it from having the courage to face the pain all the way down. So in my bus tour that I'm doing ongoing, it's part of our community program, we set up a forgiveness table. So we give kids, and big kids, by the way, it's the same skills and tools, a piece of paper. And we ask them to write down a time when their feelings were hurt. Or, by the way, they hurt someone else's feelings. And it is amazing. Even kids that come up to the table with just their eyeballs showing, I mean, that's how young they are. They know exactly what we're talking about. And so if they can't write yet, they can draw. So they start drawing these really elaborate scenarios. And I was watching one 6-year-old little girl at a stop that we made, and she was just a quintessential 6-year-old little girl. She was just so precious. And she was writing, I am so sorry, SORE, for FORE, everything I done. So sorry. And I'm thinking, what could she have done that she's so sorry for? So she did the act of forgiveness. She wadded it up and walked over. So we had 2 trash cans, one with self, one with other, because you can forgive yourself and you can forgive somebody else. She threw her wadded up piece of paper, which is the act of letting it go, into the self waste paper basket. And then I turned around and there was another 6-year-old, and they were tearing up their paper. They were so angry. I didn't know what they wrote, but beads of sweat, a big vein down the center of the forehead, red face, just so angry. And I said, that's right. Take that hurt, just rip it up. What are you going to do with it? And they walked over to the waste paper basket, slam dunked it into other, and started walking away. And I said, did that feel good? And they turned around and looked at me and said, better. it's this relief valve. It's these skills and tools that we learn to help us regulate and to manage our emotions. We're not born with these skills and tools. We can learn them. And it is so vitally important because we all have those feelings, and all emotions are fine. We all have difficult emotions. They're actually information. They teach us, but we need to be able to know what to do with them. And anger is a great one to talk about because we all feel anger. Anger can be a very good emotion. It can help us understand that our boundaries are being violated. It can give us energy to help solve the problem. But there is always an underlying feeling to anger, always. And if you can't identify the underlying feeling, you can't manage the anger. There's a lot to this, but it's simple. And once you know it, then you practice it. And it's something that you'll practice, obviously, for the rest of your life. That's why they're called essential life skills. And yeah, I go in and I talk about love, and I talk about hurt and pain. And these kids need this because, per our mental health crisis, our kids are feeling a lot of pain. Suicide sometimes turns into homicidal thoughts. That's where some of these school shooters have been, wanting to kill themselves. And then it turns into wanting to take their pain out on as many others as they can. I mean, I think we really need to talk about this, Colin, at an adult level. Our kids are killing themselves and each other at unprecedented levels. I don't think that there is anything more important that we need to be focusing on as a nation in our schools as well than keeping our children safe and their health and well-being.
Scarlett Lewis, another remarkable thing that Jesse did was to leave a note for his older brother saying, have a lot of fun. And I think that was probably not just for him, or maybe it was for him at that moment, but it feels like something with a much more widespread implication. How have you been able to incorporate that part of Jesse's message into what you do?
That is incorporated into everything that I do. That was part of how we lived as a family. We were always looking for fun. And that was just simply amazing when JT found that little note all tightly folded up on his desk. And I read it and I thought it was an absolutely perfect last message from a little brother to his big brother. And then I realized that that was for all of us, that it's really important that we not lose sight of that. We need to have that fun in our lives. And I incorporated that into the Choose Love movement and our free programming. It's everywhere. It's throughout all of it. In fact, every lesson has a have a lot of fun section because it is so important. And that's what kids want to do. And it's what teachers need to do.
This is my last question, and it's almost a stupid question, but I want to ask it anyway. Scarlett Lewis, how are you? How are you right now? This is obviously a very, very painful occasion, this 10-year remembrance. How are you doing?
That's a great question. And I took notice of something you said earlier in the interview, which was the families went through a prolonged grieving process. And we're still grieving, or I guess I can't speak for anyone else, but I can speak for myself. I mean, the loss is still palatable every day in my life. You get used to it somewhat, but I liken it to having lost a limb. There's phantom pain in that limb. I guess that goes away, but it doesn't when you have a child. You always want them to be there. They should be there. And so, yes, I have much joy and happiness in my life. And Jesse's older brother and I have a lot of fun. That is true. But there is always a missing element. Of course, we know that he's here with us in spirit. And I have a strong faith. And that really is what helps me get through. But every day I cry and then I find joy, and I kind of think that's a little bit like life. It's a little bit like a roller coaster, or I say, that blow up guy that's long and in front of car dealerships sometimes that goes down, is doubled over, and then he comes back up and his hands go up. And I kind of feel like that's life. And I will tell you one thing, I have experienced post-traumatic growth, and I have learned so much in the last 10 years. And that includes these essential life skills that we now teach that I didn't have before the tragedy. And they have truly helped me get through the difficulty that I've had in the last 10 years in so many different ways. And I am absolutely grateful.
Scarlett Lewis founded the Jessie Lewis Choose Love movement after her son, 6-year-old Jessie Lewis, was murdered during the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. Scarlett Lewis, thank you for sharing your time and yourself today.
Thank you, Colin.
Before we have our final segment here, I do want to say a couple of thank yous. Kat Pastor is, as always, the technical producer of The Colin McEnroe Show. The senior producer of The Colin McEnroe Show is Lily Tyson, and she's the producer of this episode. Joining us now is somebody that I talked to kind of a lot, as I recall anyway, 10 years ago. John Woodall is a psychiatrist, medical director of Newtown TMS, and the representative for the Baha'i community to the Newtown Interfaith Council. He hosts the podcast Notes from Newtown, which highlights examples of resilience in Newtown to help traumatized communities. And John, I think I said at the time 10 years ago that it was something almost a little eerie about the fact that you were living in Newtown. You'd done so much work elsewhere in this nation and elsewhere in the world on the issues of trauma and resilience related to 9/11 and to things that had happened elsewhere in the world. And there you were in Newtown, in a place that needed you desperately at the time. And I guess maybe, this is a question that you won't be able to answer easily, but I remember how we spoke 10 years ago. And I'm wondering, as you've had to sit with this for another 10 years, how does it feel right now? How are you digesting everything that you went through 10 years ago as this remembrance crops up now?
Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to join you, Colin. There's so much to say. Mm-hmm. There's just so much to say. The thing we were hoping for 10 years ago, I think we're seeing that right from the midst of anguish, from the midst of grief, from the midst of suffering, can come some of the most beautiful aspects of human nature. And we're seeing that. And so, you can't be happy for the way things have unfolded or the roots from which they spring. But if there is a good outcome that could be had, you're seeing evidences of it in a town that still struggles and individuals that still struggle mightily. I'm still in the middle of my clinical day. I have several patients to see still. Every single one of them is struggling in one way or another with what happened. So it's a mixed bag, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that too. And obviously you have that podcast, but I've been just bowled over by the podcast that WSHU has done called Still Newtown, which I think really kind of gets at some of the things that you're talking about, the things that people found, kind of sifting through the rubble of Sandy Hook, finding things that were important to carry forward. But when you talk about those bright spots or the things that people discovered about themselves or the world or the universe, sort of say more about what you mean specifically.
Well, we live in a culture that doesn't do suffering very well. It's all about, what do they say? You're either living an aesthetic life or an anesthetic life. Our culture is very good at anesthetizing, and you're not living a good life unless you're wonderfully happy all the time. Completely unrealistic expectations. So to find that from the midst of such horrible suffering, something that we naturally and instinctively want to avoid, that there's actually tenderness that emerges, that there's humility and kindness, there's compassion that emerges, that there's self-sacrifice and the willingness to be of loving care to other people. Despite the suffering, these are wonderful things. And they're often not spoken about because our culture doesn't really have a lot of language for that. And we pathologize every natural process is turned into some kind of psychological pathology. So grieving itself is given, pathological connotations and not just something that every culture in every time of history has had to find some answers to give life meaning. And all of that to say, I know I'm rambling a little bit, but there are just so many examples of loving kindness and tenderness and joining together in ways that no one could have expected 10 years ago. I certainly didn't.
I agree with and like what you say about the way that our culture works. And it's essentially a secular culture. And it's interesting because you go back to the sacred traditions of almost any spiritual or religious practice, and the conversation is very different in some respects. And I just, getting ready for this, read some texts from the Baha'i tradition, and they say similar things, which is this is in many respects when the conversation starts, at the point of grief, at the point of tribulation, at the point of calamity. This is in some ways when a very important conversation starts about your relationship to what is not seen, but your relationship to the universe. And to your point, John, about what kind of person you're going to be in this world, that in a way you don't really necessarily have the meat of that conversation until you've seen some of the real darkness.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. It's so interesting that we're having this conversation today. Over the last week or so, I've had the following conversation with a few people about how exactly because of the suffering, exactly because of the anguish, it acts as a kind of portal, a kind of doorway into the full expanse of life. That there's a preciousness that one begins to perceive very viscerally about the value of every breath, about all of life. And it seems that from that, all other virtue seems to spring, our loving kindness to each other, our willingness to be sacrificial, our compassionate understanding of the struggle of others, or our willingness to be forgiving even. All of those spring from the price paid by anguish. So, I just have a real quick example.
Sure.
I had a patient who was at a homeless shelter in Boston many years ago. He's a very accomplished artist. And he kept painting a picture of the temple to Athena, the frieze of the temple to Athena at Pergamon in what is now Turkey, but was then part of ancient Greece. And it's a picture of depicting the battle of the gods and the titans for control of the world. So here are these puffed up massive titans fighting the gods, and there's a statue of Athena holding the hair of one of these titans, and she just can flip him around like he's a piece of paper. He's nothing in the hands of Athena. And here it is on the major temple, the frieze of the major temple for the whole democratic city of Pergamon. And the idea behind it is that we are powerless at some point in our life to the fates, right? But it is that in that powerlessness that we learn humility, our sense of measure in the world, and those are the foundations for our sense of comity and our sense of reciprocity with each other. And those are the foundations of democracy. Again, a long-winded way of saying that the way we manage suffering, I think, plays a big part in our in the republic, in whether or not we manage as a people who becomes tribal and angry and blaming, or becomes compassionate and kind, humble and inclusive. So I really think the example of places like Newtown and really all over the country, these are potentially little incubators for, well, we'd like to see at least the younger people, taking that lesson, and that because the country is in desperate need. And so I relate what we're going through in Newtown to kind of the regeneration of the spirit of the country.
Earlier in the show, I was talking to Governor Malloy, and I mentioned something that a mutual friend of ours had said to me when I started to go through a time of real tribulation and grief. And my friend said to me, you've gotten through your whole life by being smart, and that's how you've solved everything. And that's not going to work this time. Being smart is not going to be the solution. And I see that as applicable across a broad spectrum. In a way, it's whatever you thought your superpower was And you use the word humble. Whatever you thought your superpower was, when you face something like this, you should begin by accepting it doesn't work. Whatever it was, you're so strong, you're so funny, you're so handsome, you're so smart, whatever it was, put that down, put it away, and ask yourself, what else have I got?
Yeah, well, and that's what happened in capital letters in Newtown. You mentioned the Newtown Interfaith Council, and what we noticed, we'd been very cordial with each other, and very respectful and appreciative and kind, and we really were friendly. But once the tragedy happened, it's as if again fate had just shorn us, just ripped from us any artifice that or pretense of position or status or special status, and all that was left was our raw, aching, vulnerable humanity. And it's a shame to say that sometimes we have to be reduced to that to finally see that we really need each other. We really need each other, and that we're really all struggling in a similar way to find our way. So, and it's from that soil, I think, that all the good can happen. It's a kind of successful suffering, I guess, if you will. So, and again, seeing how that extends not only in an individual person's making meaning, but in a couple, and how we relate to each other in a community, and what the foundations are of a democracy. Do we see each other as part of one thing? So again, I just wanted to just restate that this idea that how we suffer, I think, determines the quality of the democracy. I think we did a bad job after 9/11, and you're with us or you're against us kind of mentality, and I don't think we do this well. So maybe we're getting another chance here.
Right. I like that phrase, successful suffering, too, because I think the other thing that we are, and this came up a few years ago in a conversation that I had with Nelva Marquez Green, what we are is a very solution-oriented society, too. I mean, basically, that's what we think we should be doing. Oh, you've got this problem? Take this pill. Go see this person over there. Get one of these. And what we're not particularly good at is preparing ourselves for the situation, even though we might ultimately want to seek out and achieve some kind of resilience. Prior to resilience, there really is a period of time of, yes, at best, successful suffering, and the admission that there isn't a fix.
Yeah, and the whole word, I'm supposed to be like a resilience expert, and I don't like the word anymore. It's because it can be just another pablum, another kind of bromide. Don't suffer, be resilient, or don't face the enormity of what's confronting you. Be resilient, like you said, like a pill you consume. But again, I think the resilience comes from being in that position where all artifice has been stripped from you, and you're that titan in the grip of Athena, and you learn humility, and you learn your obligation to life, that it not only owes you something, but you owe life something, and that means each other.
I love that story that you told about the homeless man who was your patient. Also partly because of this is sort of how he expresses himself, but also because of the nature of this. We're a species that thrives on words and language. It's one of the things that really kind of distinguishes us. And I do think that, I've been talking to my producers about the idea that we should do a show about the truly ineffable. What are the things that don't have words? And I think we're in an area right now where you and I are trying to use words right now. But I don't know about you, but as I prepared for today's show and for the remembrance and everything like that, at a certain point I thought, I don't want to read anymore. I don't want to talk anymore. I don't want to write anymore. I started drifting much more towards music. I started picking out very specifically the music that we would use on this show. And yes, I mean, obviously there are ways in which the visual arts can speak to us and find ways of getting past everything about words and language that is ultimately limiting. And I'm guessing that you see that a lot. Well, I know for a fact that Newtown has really used things that aren't words an awful lot of the time to begin the healing process, or at least the process of trying to find some other vocabulary.
Yeah, well, and again, isn't that what art is? It's trying to give expression to the ineffable. Otherwise, it's just representation. So, no, I absolutely agree. The work we did in New York City after 9/11 was all about building resilience or these understandings using the arts. Yeah, no, I'm in complete agreement. this ineffable state is, again, something that we're not comfortable with in this culture that needs tangible transactional kinds of interactions with people. But there's that pause. I just want to just say one thing about some of the people closest to the circle of anguish in this experience in Newtown have come to be what I think they're almost luminous.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about their bearing that is that ineffable sense, that ineffable kind of transcendent presence that is just filled with gratitude and filled with kind of just presence, being present in the moment. And, you'd like to think there are some big formulaic answers that, like you said, take this and you'll be resilient. But I don't know that there's any way around it. There's the only way to that kind of state is through the middle of the pain. And, if along the way we find better language, that's wonderful. But sometimes, we need to respect that some things can't be expressed. And there's both an isolation in that and a reverie in that, because it can be terrifying also to not, until you've kind of had that sense of, what T.S. Eliot says, that refining fire that takes our yearnings and turns it into prayer almost, that, until you've achieved that ineffable sense can be terrifying and can be the thing that generates blame or anger or tribalism. But when it's refined and you find yourself connected to something, life, these large rhythms of life, then it's profoundly elevating and exalting even. Again, language that we don't use in this culture.
So, John Woodall, I have one last question for you. How are you? You're a psychiatrist, so you have to worry about how other people are, and you're in your capacity as a part of a community of faith, similar things. How are you?
Well, thanks for asking. I think I've come to feel that anything that happens in life is part of the beauty of it. So I'm not afraid of the anguish of it. I don't run from that, and you can see beauty in it. And so I'm mostly profoundly grateful for the privilege of being able to be with people as they struggle to find meaning. And I think it's a great gift.
All right, John Woodall, that is a beautiful place for us to end the show. Thank you so much for spending time with me today.
It's great. Thanks, Colin. Thanks for everything you do.
Okay, I want to thank John Woodall and the other guests as well. Obviously, this is a difficult day. It's a difficult time. This has been a hard show to do. I've had tears in my eyes more than once while doing it. I hope, though, that you understand the importance of not forgetting this story.